I'd like to add to what Mary Alice was saying more on what I do in a practical application in the lab. So a little bit about VO2Max and how you measure it, but also the things that lie underneath. So you can look at how maximally your engine is running, but what is it burning to get there, and how can you target certain areas of your metabolism to refine what it is you'd like to do. So in some respects, this will just be adding some context and relevance to what you would do with the VO2Max measurement and how that would refine your perspective on training, for example. So the questions on intervals, etc. So it's nice to have an evidence-based approach to fitness and wellness and taking the lab a step further and applying it to things like nutrition, rest, exercise intensity, and frequency. So the testing is quite simple. I mean, there's actually, like the Canadian Home Fitness Test, if you have a heart rate monitor and a box or some steps, you can get your max heart rate anywhere between 8 to 12 minutes of high intensity effort, looking at your heart rate. So there are algorithms, there's formulas, there's a lot of different ways to do it. So looking at, oh, I need to get to my VO2Max, again, you can do it in a step-like format where you just increase the intensity. If some of you have either visited me or done the Revo test, you know, it's gas on, gas off, and it just keeps amping up until you hit fatigue. So there are a lot of different ways to look at VO2Max. Again, and nowadays the algorithms are getting much tighter, so you can actually have a watch or device that can somewhat validate it within 5% of your actual. What's a little dodgy about some of the devices is the actual repeatability of them. So the precision of these instruments isn't always great. So what you measure at A may not be the same measure at B, and now you're looking at a 10 to 15 to 20% spread of the numbers that you get. So it's nice to find a good way to measure VO2Max occasionally for the reasons that Mary Alice mentioned, to make sure that you're actually progressing and using a device that gives you some valid data. So the reasons I think you hit on these pretty well. It can be a health check, so why would you want to know your VO2Max? But also, there's the tailored training. So we can fine-tune training whether you're an elite athlete or a recreational or a beginner. So we can start to peel away at what happens as you approach VO2Max so that you can prescribe things like training zones. You can look at strengths and weaknesses in an athlete. So for the elite, they already have a really high VO2Max. They're already really talented. But how are they going to get that extra 1%? So the marginal gains at the elite level, testing can really bring some of these to light. And then we look at recreational. Yes, that's great to have training zones as well. So for example, people ask about interval training. Well, what is high intensity? You might know your VO2Max, maybe we can carve out some heart rates. Is that appropriate for you at the time? So will that favor a certain nutritional intervention for you? So it's not as though, hey, we're striving to get to the finish line as quickly as possible, but maybe we need to lose a few % body fat. Maybe we need to work on our movement economy. Maybe we need to focus on things that are a little bit outside of the scope of just, you know, hitting it hard every day. So those are ways where we can really expand a little bit in terms of the relevance of VO2Max to an individual. Again, whether you're recreational, somewhat competitive, or elite. So these other variables, those training zones, we can look at those as prescriptive thresholds and identify opportunity. So oftentimes you might have somebody who has a really high capacity for speed or fast output, fast twitch, etc. But looking at metabolism and how the body works, that individual might actually benefit from slowing down a little bit in their training. So you look for certain loopholes, and again, this kind of comes out of looking at that VO2Max measurement, pulling the measurements and just kind of seeing what's happening along the way. And then what do we learn about your metabolism when we're looking at these VO2Max measurements in the lab setting is the nutrition prescription for what is your carbohydrate and fat burning like, and then we look at pairing exercise intensity with specific nutritional interventions. So if we want to focus on fat burning, well, we want to do it both nutritionally and through exercise. We can identify key variables for that. Maybe your fat burning is really good, but you're not too good with your glycolytic, you're carbohydrate burning, so we need to do more high intensity, and you would shift your nutrition regimen based on those exercise regimens as well. And then we can also pull metrics on technique. So your economy of movement. So you can do it in a submaximal test where you don't actually go to max, but you spend longer periods of time at lower paces to look at your economy of movement. So for example, how much O2 are you taking up to run a certain speed? So sometimes runners, we find the higher their VO2 max, or the lower their VO2 max, the more economical they are when you start to look at the elite level. So there's a lot of different things that you can carve out of these tests, specifically when you're in the lab with the right instruments. So there's a lot to learn from messing around in the lab and just looking at all those added benefits. So what's good about knowing your VO2 max, or as I'll get to, the other variables associated with VO2 max, is self-awareness. So it gets you thinking a little bit more critically about what you're doing for exercise. It might give you some parameters to work around. It might give you some variability in your workout habits. Accountability. So for those of you who have the opportunity to test fairly regularly, I mean, you probably wouldn't need to test more than 2 or 3 times a year, depending on your starting point. But it gives you a sense of accountability when you start to look at measuring these metabolic or cardiorespiratory data points. So you might feel more accountable knowing you have to go, and even more so if you have to go pay and you want to get something measured, you're probably going to dial in a little bit better, knowing you're going to get more out of that visit. And then we look at the measurable adaptations. So yeah, feel great, but are we actually seeing it hit your sport? Or maybe you feel great, but you're still not sleeping well. Or maybe you feel great and you crave donuts at 2 o'clock every afternoon. So can you feel better? So we want to look at things, well, what worked? We applied specific parameters. We followed some certain guidelines. We measured some baselines. What actually worked, what helped, what inspires you. So there's a lot of good benefits to testing, especially when you kind of peel back the layers. Even if you're just getting that VO2 max number and even some heart rate with it, it can be super valuable in terms of your application. So I'll just kind of go into some examples of, well, what's lying underneath this VO2 max. So it was your second slide. We've got endocrine function, we've got cardiorespiratory function, we've got neuromuscular function, a lot of things happening. So what I like to geek out on is, well, what's actually happening as we get to VO2 max? So here's an example. We're actually looking at ventilatory equivalence and oxygen uptake. So it looks a little bit different in terms of that orange line, but this is for a cyclist. This is actually a cyclist who I tested last year, and he just got signed on to the Sky team. So he's a 20-year-old pro. He was in the Vuelta a España that just finished a couple months ago, or a couple weeks ago. Very high VO2 max. So this kid weighs about 135 pounds. He's 6 feet tall, and he puts out 370 watts at the end of a 1-hour threshold test. So we start very easy. So if many of you have done the Revo test, it's 8 to 12 or 12 to 15. This kid can really put out a lot of watts for a long period of time. But what's interesting is if you look at those 2 points, those are what we call ventilatory inflection points, and how you can carve out training zones for somebody. So we're looking at 2 distinct turn points in his metabolism. So anything to the left of the first dot we call aerobic, and what's associated with aerobic output is a high degree of fat contribution to the energy pool. So we see this is what's called a fat oxidation curve or a fat burning curve. We can see his fat max is right in the middle or very close to that first aerobic threshold. And as you keep moving to the right, putting out more and more watts, you can see his caloric expenditure ramping up there for fat calories, and then it starts to drop because he starts to dive into his carbohydrate metabolism more aggressively. So carbohydrates is kind of like, there's no on-off switch for our fuels, but if you want high octane, we go to carbohydrate. So I like to think of the body functions a bit like a hybrid car. You want to get as much out of that electric motor as possible, and you want to spare your petrol, but if it runs out of gas, you're stuck on the side of the road. So you always want to make sure that depending on if you're running late to the airport heading south on 19th Avenue or you're on the 5 cruising, you're going to use very different utility out of those 2 engines. So what we want to do is optimize, because again, you want to spare your petrol, and the other benefit is if you're more on the electric, you're not producing as much emissions. So the muscles like that, the cells like that, the brain likes that. So what we try to do is push that fat max as close to that aerobic threshold as possible. So his actually looks great. He's burning almost 500 fat calories at a pretty high output. And if any of you are familiar with professional cycling or how things work, the longer you can sit in and do nothing and then really pull off a face melter in the last 20 kilometers, you're aces. So the best is to be able to spare that precious high-octane petrol till later in the race. So you can see where we hit that second threshold, which there's a lot of different terms for it. We can call it an anaerobic threshold, and that's where carbohydrate metabolism really amps up. So you can see fat drops precipitously, and then if there's another graph, we'll look at where carbohydrate takes off. But here's just something else that we can learn from this athlete's VO2 max, from measuring it. Now here's an athlete, his VO2 max was, I think, 84. So we're not really, he already has a high aerobic capacity, we just need to tweak the engine a little bit. So looking at his curve, we knew he was ready to start doing some intensity. So these are things that really help the specificity of exercise, pulling measurements, getting that metabolic data, and looking a little bit more critically at the data points. So here's one for an athlete where we did a pre and post, just 6-week nutrition and exercise plan that really focused on fat metabolism, and you see a profound shift after 6 weeks. If you look at the gray lines, we have calories on the Y and we have power on the X. So fat calories post went up about 100 calories per hour, and he's also putting about 15 more watts. So he's doing more work and he's burning more fat at a higher intensity. And then if you look at the associated carbohydrate outtake, or really sparing his carbohydrate, that dropped by quite a lot as well. So now this particular individual is burning much more efficiently based on that perspective of fats and carbohydrate burning, because there is a point where if you focus too much on fat max, you might lose performance, or you're just metabolically not as balanced. So for example, if you spend all day, every day exercising at your fat max, you're going to be missing out on those cardiovascular benefits that were just mentioned earlier. So we'll look at even at higher intensities at 190 watts, that's significantly less carbohydrate burned. So this person can sit at higher intensities for longer periods of time. And for those of you who might do endurance sport, this means a lot less stress on the gut. So oftentimes with ultramarathon runners, cyclists, etc., their main issue is gastrointestinal stress, especially in things like Ironman or Ironman events, or those longer distance. If there's a long bike portion, people tend to overeat, and then they're done for the run part of the event. So you want to think about...
I'm not understanding these lines.
I don't know what they mean either. Well, I don't say it. No, sorry, so the gray line, those two gray lines, that's fat burning. So if you look at calories on the Y, so you can see it, he's burning 200 fat calories at 100 watts versus post 6 weeks of focusing on those energy systems, it's up closer to 300.
So the confusion is like the dotted line and the solid line. What is the pre and what is the...
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a very good question. It's not in the legend there. Who made this graph? So the post is the gray line. Yeah, the better stuff. Yeah, so carbohydrate expenditure dropped and fat burning improved.
So after the 6 weeks of training,
Yes.
that's the difference.
Yeah. And that included target exercise intensity plus a nutritional intervention. So we see that jump from the dotted line, 6 weeks post, we have the solid line.
That target training in the fat burning zone.
Yes. So it's centered around that intensity.
So basically it says in pre at 140, 50 watts, that was the pre, he changed the fat burning zone to hard.
Yep.
And after the training, it's 175 watts, so he gained 20 watts.
Yes.
Yeah, pretty much. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Pritpal. Good to see you. Any more questions on that horrible graph?
For a given wattage, you added up the fat plus the calories. Are they equal for both states? Like
There will be a 50-50 point. There's like a crossover, if that's what you mean, when they become...
The total energy consumed is
Right.
like the same at approximately at one.
Yes, energy expenditure doesn't change that much, unless you have somebody who has really profound efficiency gains, but for the most part, the total calories burned are similar. It's just the percent contribution changes.
Green fat.
Correct, yeah. So in that example, it might be at, 60-40 or something versus 50-50, but the total cal burn is very similar. But there are some individuals, if they're not exercising a lot, and that's 6 to 8 weeks, just from the movement patterns, they'll gain a lot of efficiency and they'll see low cals, but still the percent contribution will shift.
In that specific case, what did you guys change for him to have that adaptation to get more efficient over that period?
Essentially so this was a great case study because it was a big shift, but this particular person spent a lot of time exercising at fairly high intensities, and it was kind of the same intensity all the time. It was more just working out versus training, and they were eating a lot of carbohydrates. So the body will, I'm sorry, did I miss the?
So, like, did you add something to his diet at all, or he kept the same diet?
Yeah, he changed his diet.
Higher carb or lower carb?
Lower carb.
Lower carb.
Yeah, so I was just painting the whole picture where
Okay, yeah.
he was eating high carbohydrate, exercising at high intensity, and a lot of these individuals have knee pain, they don't sleep well, they're irritable, they have some weight gain, so just back them off. So when you're exercising in a maximal fat burning zone, it's easier to eat lower carbohydrate regimen because you're not burning them, you don't crave them. And then once you get that hormonal milieu to shift, then it's a more sustainable output. And then you increase carbohydrate based on your exercise outflows. So for athletes, the ideal nutrition plan depends on what that day's output is. So for this individual, if they spend a long period of time in 190 watts, burning 720 carbohydrate calories, even in this adapted state, they're going to need to up their carbohydrate intake during and post-exercise to make up for that, to fill that tank. Whereas if they're exercising at the lower intensities, they won't need that much carbohydrate. So if they want to go on a lower glycemic or, just say more vegetables, beans, and legumes and less bread, rice, pasta, you're still getting in your carbohydrates and keeping your tank full, but that's more sustainable because you're not burning them all day.
So does this go beyond the obvious of, okay, he's eating less carbs, so there's less carbs available for his body to burn and for it to work more fat? Is it beyond that obvious?
That's a simplistic way, but oftentimes it's hormonal.
Is there something beyond that? So does something shift beyond, like obviously he's going to burn less carbs because he's eating less than he's fat. So yeah, does something in the way that his body utilizes it shift
Yes.
beyond?
So if you stimulate where your body is best at mobilizing fats, then you will increase the rate at which they're released, the enzymes that are associated with burning them. You change your hormonal milieu, so you drop insulin levels, which tends to suppress fat metabolism a little bit. So there's a lot going on at the chemistry of it that definitely changes. I mean, not that I'm pulling biopsies or anything, but you can see it in the calorimetry. If I were, I wouldn't say it in front of you. So does that help with that?
You're also changing this training protocol.
Absolutely, yeah. The exercise and the nutrition have to shift. Otherwise, you get a disconnect. 2 weeks later, it's done. And that's where I get a lot of people that are having an issue because I'm going to go on a high-fat diet, and I'm still going to exercise at 80% of my VO2Max all the time. That lasts about 7 to 10 days. And then you just hit the wall.
So in order to be more efficient at the same fat, you have to train a little less of your
Correct. And that's where a good exercise regimen would include various intensities throughout the week.
But the main focus in this is the 6 week of tuning that person's body according to his body. Might be that the fat burning is X person, it works for X, but Y the other way works. But this main focus out here I see is the 6 week of specificity training for that person made him improve that. If he would have gone in that specific training, the way nutrition and all is changed in that person, the graph might be different.
keep you guys awake. Let's get away from the graph here for a second. So there's just a couple of examples of how VO2 max can shift, and we need to keep in mind that when we see changes in VO2 max for older individuals, it means that maybe when we first measured it, they weren't at a level where they were really taxing their genetic capacity at that time. And of course, as mentioned before, it depends on your mass as well. So VO2 max can change. We have to look at it in absolute and relative terms. But here's a 48-year-old who did a lot of mountain bike riding and just rode cycling. We just kind of went out and rode however he felt like it and ate however he felt, and he wanted to tidy things up because he wanted to train for a 200-mile bike ride. So we just kind of put him on a 2-month plan where it was geared more around thresholds, a little bit of fat metabolism, shifting up his diet, and increased his riding time by a little bit, but it wasn't a whole lot of high intensity. It was more just, well, let's just get the whole system functioning clean before we start to hit it hard with high intensity. But you can see for a 48-year-old male, we have an increase. So from looking from left to right, this was after 2 months of some specificity training. So we shifted, his VO2 max went from 43.8 to 49. And a significant part of that was his kilograms changed. So the absolute 4.31 liters per minute, and then his absolute 4.5. So it's still a shift, but his percent body fat dropped quite a bit, and he lost quite a little bit of weight there too. So he had a big drop in fat mass. So he's lighter, he's getting more utility out of a slightly bigger engine. So here's a 48-year-old who increases VO2 max, which is pretty cool to see. And then we look at that fat max number, so kind of going back to that graph before. So he's putting out 40 more watts at his maximal fat burning rate. And he's lighter, and he has a higher peak capacity. So this is where, with some targeted training, we can start to see more global adaptation.
Sorry, Tim, if you already mentioned this, but how are you measuring the fat calories?
Through the metabolic cart. I'll show a video of a test. So the open circuit calorimetry, or the indirect measurement. So the device that she'd mentioned before, it's capturing all of your expired O2 and CO2, and we measure the fractions of O2 and CO2, and we know what molecules are being combusted to produce that energy. So we know the chemical formulas for burning fat and glucose, and we can look at what's being burned by those O2, CO2 fractions that are being measured by that machine.
So for that person with 150, the fat max 150, and that 150 watts was his ideal fat burning.
That's where he was burning the most fat calories. The best his body could do at that point.
So that increased to 190.
Yeah, so he's putting out 40 more watts, and he's burning more fat calories. So next we'll look at a 68-year-old. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I just realized the question. So that means that I can keep on running at 190 watts basically all day then.
Pretty much, and you still have to, yeah.
Basically, instead of only going for, if I'm at 190 previous, I can only go to say 4 hours, but now I can do 190 for, how much fat I have in my, to reasonable limits. So basically, I just increase my endurance in sort of ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is somewhat, there's some other factors involved, but yes, you're absolutely right. That's why we want to, like when we looked at that pro athlete's profile, we want to push that out as high as we can.
We saw the equation for VO2 max was heart rate times the stroke
volume.
What was the other? AVO2 difference. So when you're training, what variable can you influence?
You kind of influence all of them because your blood volume goes up. Your enzymes available for that arteriovenous extraction. So we extract more O2, so the muscles get better at pulling O2 out. So you have the surface area for oxygen consumption the size of a tennis court. We cannot extract all that through the muscles, so that just comes and goes. So the more you train the muscle site, we have mitochondrial density, which are the units of the cell that extract O2 to produce energy. The enzymes allow those reactions to happen in a millionth of a second. Your blood volume goes up, so sometimes heart rates can plateau or even come down as somebody gets more fit. Because if there's more fluid in the system, the heart doesn't have to beat as quickly. So we increase blood volume, we have those cellular adaptations, and sometimes the heart can actually get a little stretch and pump a little harder. So there's a lot of little things that can happen.
So at a certain point, those are just gonna plateau, right? Like those won't continuously get bigger.
Pretty much.
Right? So it
Yeah.
seems like
Marginal gains.
to maximize your VO2 max, you just want to decrease your fat content, right? Because
Well, that will do it.
You're normalizing your VO2 to your body mass.
That'll do it in a relative sense. So I keep skipping over this.
More efficiently
Yeah.
based on population.
So if we look at this one, so you see the 2.9 liters, 2.92, but there's a subtle change in relative. So you can have the same engine, but you get a little lighter, you get a little more out of it.
But are you getting more out of it? Is it just because I'm doing the calculations based on your weight, which doesn't take into account the fat you lost in your initial calculation?
You'll go faster. Yeah.
No, but I think what you're asking, my question too, is are you actually proving your result of the calculation based on your weight that doesn't account for the fact that your weight is made up of a proportion of muscle and fat? And if you lose fat, you're going to have a high proportion of muscle, and therefore it's just going to automatically look better.
There's,
You know what I mean?
there's some of that, yeah.
You're right, this person didn't increase their fat mass. And the only reason that number got higher is because they dropped some weight.
Right.
Wouldn't that bring to the,
I think we might be stepping into like a lot of, because there's no one answer to these questions, it's just two, I think I could even skip through all this stuff and just say that whether you're 68 or you're 45, if you exercise and you apply a little specificity and you really think about, okay, VO2 max, but what else is going on? So we don't want to step away and say, okay, well, VO2 max is everything, and then just do high intensity interval training every day. So there's other factors that can be measured that can make you feel better, that can make you affect your nutrition. It can change the way you exercise. So,
at this case right here, it just basically put these watts to kilo, basically, right?
Mhm.
That takes,
Yeah.
So that's,
and that's where it's good to look at VO2 max both in the absolute and the relative. So your absolute can be 4.5, and if you lose 5 kilos, your relative is going to be higher, right? And that's how you can see, well, is it an adaptation based on the size of the individual, or is it the actual engine size? So in the first case, he improved both in absolute and relative. Here, it's pretty much a relative because he dropped 2.2% body fat. So he's lighter, but his engine size is pretty much the same. But he's getting more utility out of it as a cyclist because he's lighter. So, and that would work for a runner too. And here, the fat max, the wattage stayed the same, but he's actually burning more fat calories at that same intensity. So he's still, just the arc got a little higher, but it didn't move. So here's a female training for a half Ironman. And so we just started out from scratch and then remeasured it 4 months. So we see a 2.64 liter engine at 40.1 relative VO2 max. It went from 2.64 to 2.76 and increased that VO2 max to 44 mils per kg because again, we want to look at it in relative terms. So she lost almost 5% body fat in that time period, and we look at a 40 watt increase in fat max. So increase the engine size, we increase the efficiency of the engine, and she's lighter and just healthier overall. So here's a video of a skinny guy with a big forehead doing a VO2 max test. It's me. Oh. There we go. I think it just takes a second. Okay. I think it's playing it and pausing it. There it goes. So this is this is just a computerized bike that controls the watts. It's very accurate. It's a pretty elegant ergometer or watt meter. And then you can see we have a two-way valve, nose is clipped, all that O2 is going into a mixing chamber, and then this analyzer analyzes all the oxygen and CO2, and then it's processed very quickly by the computer, obviously, and that's where you can look at these metrics: fat burning, VO2 max, pulse. And then we have a computer that controls the specific variables, so you can look at it, so you get live feedback. So that's a quick view of a cycling VO2 max test.
So,
That dog bed's not there in my lab all the time, by the way.
maybe it's in your presentation, but it was like when I did the Revo, I didn't have a tube. I was really into tubes. So
Right.
I'm interested to see how they get the variables in the equation.
And that's where earlier in the presentation, you know, you have algorithms, you have certain elegance you can apply to do those predictions, and that's how I met Shiva, is to take his algorithms and compare it to real data. So you don't have to put that thing on and pay money and spend 2 hours in the lab. So with that, we should probably keep rolling, and I'm sure Shiva will answer some questions.
Any other last questions?
Just to kind of keep things rolling, or if you have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them once we're done with the whole presentation. But if it's less related to cellular respiration, we can talk about it. Oh, you again.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Does that imply when you become more fit that your metabolism drops?
It can, but it depends on, because your metabolic rate depends on how much lean tissue you have. So what you need, you know, how much muscle you have, for example, that's very energy dependent. So if you gain more muscle mass, your metabolic rate's going to go up.
It actually goes up. That's what at least the science would show now. On average, your resting metabolic rate goes up a little bit as your fitness improves. Your heart rate drops though, because your heart doesn't work as hard to pump out the same amount of blood. But yeah, your resting metabolic should go up on average. Because everyone's a little bit different, but yeah.
But if you measure the metabolic rate for a given intensity, after you train, it'll go down. I thought that's what you were asking.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's more fun when you're up here. Well, thank you, everybody.
Is there a counter benefit to working too hard?
I personally think yes. I think it can mess with your hormonal level and the stress to your joints, and there's some research on, you know, even scarring of cardiac tissue. But, you know, well, it's like with anything. It's the American way, well, more is better. That's not always true. So there's a point where you need to know your limits. But
Brilliant. Thank you.
thanks, everybody.